Every country has their respected touring car series. America has NASCAR. Germany has DTM. And Britain has the BTCC. In order to understand what this series is, we gotta rewind the clocks just a wee bit to the 1950s after World War II ended. You see, a secretary of the British Racing and Sports Car Club named Ken Gregory came up with an idea. What if we make a new national championship for racing that would sit between the lower levels of motorsport and sports car racing? And people went, okay, I'm thinking about it. What do you got in mind? And he's like, we can sell more cars, aka sedans, by racing them. And they went, Ken, you're a genius. You don't get a promotion though, sorry, you're still a secretary. But they decided to go ahead with this new saloon car racing series. There would be 4 classes to compete in a multi-class racing set. There was the under 1200cc class, 1200 to 1600cc, 1600 to 2700, and 2700 and above, all competing in one race, and it would be called the British Saloon Car Championship, and the inaugural season was held in 1958 across 9 racetracks in Britain. And the first ever race was actually held on December 26, 1957, at Brands Hatch. And it was won by one John Sprinzel in an Austin A35. These were not spectacular cars, I will admit, but the racing was spectacular. That is for sure. By the end of the season, 2 drivers were in contention for the championship. And when the final race came to a close, both Jack Sears, who drove an Austin A105, and Tommy Sopwith, who drove a Jag 3.4 liter, tied each other in points. Now I know you're thinking, those are in different classes, how can they tie in points? Well, this is gonna be a bit of an explanation. You see, unlike a normal multi-class endurance race, the BTCC, or the BSCC as it was called back then, was different. You see, you could win the championship without winning any races, because the bottom classes got the exact same number of points as the top tier classes. So even if you won the race outright, you got, say, 20 points. But if you won your class and scored 17th overall, you also got 20 points. I don't know how that makes sense, but that's apparently how it goes. And for whatever reason, the classes were competing against each other, which meant that the Jag and the Austin were apparently rivals, even though the Jag was about twice as fast. Now, initially they were going to decide the championship by a coin flip, but the drivers were very cross about that idea, and decided instead to go for a head-to-head race. Just those 2 drivers, identical cars. Whoever crossed the finish line with the biggest gap wins. And Sears won by 3.8 seconds to Tommy and won the first ever BSCC championship. And if you couldn't tell by the fact that the very first season in BSCC history resulted in a tie, it's gonna be a pretty crazy series already, and it got even better by the time the 60s rolled around, because they adopted the FIA Group 2 regulations, which had a bigger emphasis on road homologated versions of racing cars. So, you could have a fantastic racing car, but you had to have a road version to go with it, which is just a win-win situation. Except for Jaguar. It meant the end of Jaguar, because the Jaguars were just modified up to BTCC spec. So when they didn't have any homologation requirements, they were fine, but the minute the homologation requirements were put into place, everything kind of fell apart. So, that's quite unfortunate for them. But a new challenger quickly filled its place, and it was a bit different. Yes, the BMC Mini began, and this quickly led to the greatest aspect, some would say, of touring car racing in Britain, because you had the nimble, baby little Mini that could fit in the trunk of most vehicles today, going up against V8 monsters because the Americans had arrived. Dan Gurney showed up with a Chevy Impala in 1961. That was just a start. We had Mustangs, we had Falcons, we had Camaros especially, and they were all duking it out with the British-built Minis and Austins and etc. And it would be the Minis that actually took the victories, I'm not going to lie. The Minis were rather dominant, scoring outright victories in 1961, 1962, and 1969. The Mini was pretty damn good at racing, what can I say? It's like a little go-kart. And that wasn't the only plucky little British car to compete successfully. Jack Sears, again, and Jim Clark drove the Lotus Cortina to victory in 1963 and 1964 respectively, and things just kept getting better as the turn of the 70s showed up. Slick tires were introduced, greater engine tuning was introduced, and the speeds were getting absurd. And the only thing faster than the speeds when the faster crowds poured in. It was incredibly popular. The racing was epic. And despite the massive V8 invasion that we were mentioning earlier, the little Hillman Imp, yep, the little baby Imp, was dominant, to be honest, winning 3 back-to-back titles in 1970, 1971, and 1972. And then the problems started to emerge in the 70s, as often happens with everything in automotive history, because costs of competition became a bit high, and they started phasing out the big 7-liter monsters by shutting down the engine max requirements for displacement. So the V8s went out with a bang, though, as the Camaro Z28 with a 7-liter V8 did claim an outright victory for the championship in 1973, and in their place came new challengers, like the Hillman Avenger GT and the Ford Capri. But as those vehicles were beginning to show that they were not to be messed with, someone messed with them. And that was a familiar sight. The BMC Mini came back into the limelight with the 1275 GT. This was a fully factory-supported Mini that could handle even better, and was even lighter, and was more powerful. It was a brilliant car. In fact, it won 2 more championships in 1978 and 1979, a decade after the Mini was phased out of competition in the 60s. That is pretty darn good, I must say, for a plucky little Brit. Normally don't do too well. And after the Mini's success in 1979, it was time for the Japanese to enter the British Touring Car Championship with Mazda and Toyota. TWR took the Mazda RX-7 and the Toyota Corolla to win 3 championships, 2 for the RX-7, 1 for the Corolla. And the Japanese were here to stay, as they were a constant presence throughout the remainder of touring car racing. And the rules kept getting better, because there was a new engine limit, 3.5 liter displacement, and you could have whatever engine you want as long as it met those displacements. And that led to a bit more power. Most notably, Rover. They made the SD1, and this was a distinctive looking car. Actually pretty good looking, not gonna lie, for a Rover from the 80s. But what was really impressive was under the hood, a 3.5 liter V8 making 340 horsepower. It took the top spot in 1983 and then was disqualified due to technical infringements. So they came back with a vengeance and won again in 1984 and was not disqualified this time. And the engine rules that allowed the SD1 to compete so well was not the only big changes in the 80s. No. You see, it was time to get professional. Properly professional. And as they continued to adapt the rulebook, they changed the name from the British Saloon Car Championship to match the rest of the world. The British Touring Car Championship was officially named as such, and still carries that name to this day. And 1987 saw quite a few introductions, things like the BMW M3, and this little car called the Sierra Cosworth. You see, Ford was always a presence in touring car racing, especially in Britain with the likes of the Mustang, the Falcon, the Cortina, and the Caprice. But the Sierra may have just been their bread and butter. You see, they contacted their friends at Cosworth, you ever heard of them, and they asked to make their Sierra into a lethal weapon on the track. And they delivered the road car, which looks fantastic, I will say, with that ridiculously oversized rear wing. Made 224 horsepower from a turbocharger with a 4-cylinder engine bolted onto it. As great as the road car was, in racing trim, that 224 horsepower was dialed up to an absolutely brutal 550 brake horsepower on the track. Combine that with a partnership between Cosworth, Ford Racing, and Roush, which is like the holy trinity of Ford automotive racing, it was unstoppable. From 1987 to its ineligibility in 1990, it won 29 out of 35 races it competed in, which makes it the most successful touring car in history. And yet, it only won one championship in 1990 because of the silly rules where the lower class cars could win even if they never won a race, because the Cosworth always won, to the point where it won every single race in every single season from 1988 to 1990. Jesus Christ! As the 90s dawned, prices for these crazy Group A touring cars were getting, let's be honest, a bit excessive. So they began to tinker with the rule set and adopted a new policy called Super Touring Cars. This was designed to cut costs and increase wheel-to-wheel racing while encouraging manufacturer participation. The rules: it had to have 4 doors, it had to fit the Euro NCAP family car class, engine size was capped at 2 liters, with no more than 6 cylinders and no forced induction. We're looking at you, Sierra Cosworth. 1994 was really the peak of this super touring car class. This is where technology and cheating, or sneakiness I should say, went above any other season in British touring cars. We had Volvo enter a wagon with the 850 estate, an estate I will mention with 300 naturally aspirated horsepower that utilized a loophole in aerodynamics so it could actually be competitive and scored a 5th place, much to the humiliation of the teams that it beat. But even with 10 manufacturers competing and homologation specialists going wild, one true standout was Alfa Romeo, who entered the 155. This had a 2-liter i4 per the rules, making 285 horsepower, but that was not the main feature. The main feature was its sneaky aerodynamics, similar to the Volvo but different in a slightly tweaked way. You see, they designed the 155 with a normal spoiler and a normal lip spoiler. However, in order to maximize downforce, they made the front lip spoiler detachable so it could be reattached in a larger position than the road car, and they added little tiny strut towers that you could remove and put on for the rear spoiler that raised it up an extra 4 inches. Now, these were not found on the road car, but it was found on the race car, and that would be illegal unless they specified it in the rule book. Now, if the governing body and other teams happen to look at this, they would probably raise a few alarms at this vehicle. So, Alfa Romeo made sure they couldn't find it in the rulebook. First, they put it at the very, 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 very back of the rulebook to make sure that you would have to go through the entire book to even see it. And they submitted their application for competition the last day eligible, so they would have as little time as possible to look at it before the season began. That is very, very sneaky, Alfa Romeo, very, very sneaky. And you know what? It worked. Alfa Romeo won the first 5 races in a row that year. And then Ford and Vauxhall realized that the wing was a little bit bigger than they initially advertised. They investigated it, and they were found out. So, after a lengthy legal battle that resulted in them almost losing all of their points, they were forced to run the lower aerodynamics or make a special edition homologation version to homologate them. So, Alfa Romeo made a special limited edition homologation special called the 155 Silverstone Edition. And the wings got approved for the last few rounds, and Alfa Romeo, unsurprisingly, dominated the championship and secured the title. Who says sneakiness doesn't prosper? Speaking of their aerodynamic sneakiness, the legal battle and rule loophole were so stressful and difficult on the governing body that in 1995, aerodynamic restrictions were allowed. You could do whatever the hell you wanted. They got rid of the restrictions because they're like, this isn't worth it anymore, screw it. After that is when we started to see a decline. Sadly, the BTCC suffered 2 fatal accidents in 1995 because of inferior side impact protection devices. Now those devices were quickly implemented, but costs from both the increased safety costs as well as the just sheer price of R&D to develop these cars was getting a bit out of hand. Here's a bit of a reference for that. The 1990 BTC Vauxhall Cavalier cost £60,000 for the car. Less than 10 years later, that cost had skyrocketed to £260,000. And that's in 1990s money. And by the end of the Super Touring era in 2000, only Ford, Honda, and Vauxhall remained. Now that did help Ford secure a 1-2-3 in the championship with an, at the time, all-time record of 104-point gap to second place. Yeah, Ford and their Mondeo dominated the 2000 season and then left, as did most other manufacturers. So it was, heck, at one point it was down to a 1 MiG racing series with Vauxhalls. That's how desperate it got. So they tried to, again, cut costs with this new millennium. So they simplified the aerodynamics, they reduced the usage of carbon fiber, they increased common components. They also ventured outside of Britain to try and gain more people to watch it by visiting Mondello Park in Ireland. And in order to increase strategy use in racing, they mandated pit stops in 2003. But this didn't really work, so they introduced the next generation touring car in 2010 in order to further cut costs while incentivizing manufacturers to compete. This basically turned the touring car series into a spec series. every single component of the car was standardized except for the drivetrain that have front-wheel drive or rear-wheel drive and the body shell. Everything else was more or less standardized as to cut costs. And it actually kind of worked, not gonna lie. In the 2019 lineup included BMW, Honda, Vauxhall, and Subaru and Toyota, which is their most official manufacturers competing for the championship in years, as well as independent entries that were not competing for the championship, such as Ford, Mercedes, Audi, Infiniti, MG, and Volkswagen. And the racing is very, very good. Touring cars have always been spectacular in their racing, whether they be wheel-to-wheel or window-to-window, depending on what year you're looking at. But they haven't really been able to climb out of the shadow of the super touring regulations of the 90s, just because there were so many manufacturers competing with so many different variations of engine and drivetrain and body shell. It was impossible to replicate with these new regulations, so while they cut costs, they also cut development, they also cut advancement, and that's honestly part of the reason why you watch racing, because you never know what they're going to do next. Think about it, all the greatest racing series out there, Can-Am, Group B, Formula 1, Super Touring, they all had rapid technological development, and this series just doesn't have it. But hey, the racing is still very, very good.